You see, there's a strange thing about boundaries. Most people think of them as physical or visible, something you can mark or draw in the sand. But the most important boundaries you'll ever create are invisible, and they exist in language, in tone, in the words you choose. There is an enormous difference between reacting emotionally to someone's mistreatment and deliberately crafting a single sentence that communicates, without a hint of doubt, this is where I end, and you do not get to cross. That's the power of a boundary in words. And for a narcissist, that's terrifying, not because the sentence is cruel, but because it strips away their favorite game, blurring the lines between their world and yours so they can invade without you noticing. When you draw that line verbally, you essentially tell them, I see what you're doing, and I will not participate. The sentence itself doesn't need to be elaborate. In fact, the simpler it is, the more powerful it becomes. Think about it. A dozen angry accusations are easy for a manipulator to deflect or twist back onto you. But one clean, precise statement, they can't grab onto it without revealing their intent. This is where most people get it wrong. They over-explain, they justify, they try to make the narcissist understand. But when you do that, you hand them more material to work with. The narcissist thrives on that confusion, on those spirals of maybe you're right, maybe I misunderstood. A boundary sentence, however, cuts that loop to pieces. It's not an invitation to debate, it's a declaration. And declarations don't ask for permission. And here's the deeper layer. When you say that sentence, you're not only speaking to them, you're speaking to yourself. You're reaffirming your own worth, your own right to dignity. You're sending a message to the part of you that's been trained, maybe for years, to doubt itself, will not be moved. You can feel that shift inside you the moment you speak it. Your posture changes, your tone changes. You no longer sound like someone pleading for decency, you sound like someone who expects it as the bare minimum. That change is magnetic and unsettling to someone who has built their power on your uncertainty. From a psychological standpoint, the beauty of this is that it interrupts their pattern. Narcissists are like chess players who've rehearsed the same opening moves 1,000 times. They know exactly how to provoke guilt, confusion, or a need to explain yourself. When you respond with a single, firm sentence instead of a storm of emotion, you've just moved your piece to a square they didn't even know was on the board. Now they're the ones scrambling, and that's when their mask starts to slip. Of course, this requires courage. The first time you do it, your voice might shake, your heart might pound. You might even question whether you've been too harsh. But understand, the point of a verbal boundary isn't to be liked. It's to be respected. And respect is something a narcissist will never hand to you freely. You have to claim it. And you claim it by making it unmistakably clear through your words that their access to your mind and your emotions is no longer unlimited. So when you think about that one sentence, that verbal wall, don't imagine it as a weapon. Imagine it as a key. Because that's what it is. It unlocks the door you've been trapped behind, and it lets you walk out without waiting for anyone's approval. And once you know you can walk out, you'll never again be afraid of the cage. Control, for a narcissist, it's not just a preference, it's oxygen. It's the invisible fuel that keeps their carefully constructed identity alive. And the moment they sense that control slipping away, they feel as though they're drowning. That's why there is one sentence, said calmly and without apology, that they absolutely fear, because in that moment, they realize the leash they've been holding on you has snapped. You are no longer reacting the way they expect. You're not engaging in the emotional tug of war they've engineered. And for someone whose entire sense of self depends on orchestrating the emotional climate around them, that's nothing short of catastrophic. What's so remarkable about this dynamic is that control doesn't always look like control. People imagine it as obvious dominance, shouting threats, demands. But often, it's far more subtle. It's in the way they steer conversations toward their narrative. It's in the way they plant seeds of doubt in your mind so you begin questioning your own judgment. It's in how they frame your responses so you feel compelled to justify, explain, or apologize, even when you've done nothing wrong. And because this control is so quiet, so disguised, you may not even realize you've been breathing in their version of reality for months or years. But the moment you deliver that sentence, the one that refuses to play by their rules, you're doing more than just disagreeing with them. You're dismantling the very stage they've been performing on. You're telling them, I will not participate in the script anymore. And that's terrifying for them, because the narcissist's power doesn't come from reality. It comes from their ability to get you to live inside their version of it. From a psychological perspective, this is where the concept of narcissistic supply becomes critical. A narcissist feeds on emotional responses, whether they're positive, negative, or conflicted. Every argument, every explanation, every defensive statement you make is like currency in their emotional economy. So when you respond with a single firm boundary, with no extra energy, no emotional bait they can hook into, you're cutting off their supply. And when you cut off their supply, you don't just weaken their grip on you, you starve the very thing that keeps their behavior alive. This is why that sentence is so destabilizing. It's not just that you're asserting yourself, it's that you're doing it without feeding the drama. Narcissists know how to twist anger into proof that you're unreasonable, and they know how to twist tears into proof that you're too sensitive. But calm, direct, unshakable words, those are far harder to weaponize. It's like trying to grab smoke with your bare hands. There's nothing for them to hold on to. Of course, you'll see the backlash. It might come as rage, as silent treatment, as guilt tripping, or as sudden charm to reel you back in. That's because when you threaten their control, you're not just challenging a behavior, you're challenging their identity. They can't simply shrug it off, because if they lose control over you, it forces them to confront the possibility that they can lose control over others too. And that's an intolerable thought for them. So the key is not just in saying the sentence, but in holding your ground afterward, because the moment you waver, they see an opening to reassert control. But the moment you stand firm, you signal, both to them and to yourself, that their power was always an illusion, one you no longer agree to participate in. And that's the paradox. The thing they fear most is not anger, not confrontation, but your calm, unwavering refusal to be controlled. Because once you've tasted that freedom, they can never make you unlearn it. The truth is a strange thing. It's not always loud, it's not always dramatic, but is always disruptive to a lie. And a narcissist's entire identity is built on a carefully curated fiction. They live inside a self-image that must be constantly protected, constantly defended, because if even one crack appears, the whole structure threatens to collapse. That's why there are certain truths they will go to any length to avoid hearing, especially when it comes from you, someone whose opinion they've worked so hard to control. You might think the truth would inspire them to reflect, to change, but it doesn't. For a narcissist, truth is not information, it's exposure. And exposure is dangerous because it forces them to look at themselves without the filters they've spent years perfecting. When you speak that truth in one clear, unshakable sentence, you're not just communicating a fact. You're violating the unspoken contract they've tried to impose on you. The contract that says you will not name the reality of what's happening. You will tiptoe around it. You will doubt your own perceptions. You will keep quiet to preserve the peace. But in that moment, you refuse to participate in the illusion. You take the one thing they cannot control, your perception of reality, and you put it on the table for all to see. That is a profound act of defiance. It's important to understand that narcissists don't avoid the truth because they can't grasp it intellectually. They avoid it because they can't tolerate it emotionally. The truth you speak doesn't just point out a flaw in their behavior. It strikes at the core of the identity they've built. It's like pulling back the curtain into the Wizard of Oz. Once the illusion is exposed, it's impossible to see them the same way again. And they know that once you've seen behind the mask, you can't unsee it. This is why the sentence you deliver is so threatening. Because it's not just about what you're saying, it's about what it represents. It represents that you are no longer willing to play along with their story. You're not yelling. You're not pleading. You're simply stating a reality they've tried to bury. And when you do that, you force them to experience a rare and deeply uncomfortable moment, the collision between who they believe they are and who they actually are. From a philosophical perspective, truth has always been the most destabilizing force in human interaction. It doesn't need to be aggressive. It simply needs to be undeniable. And that's the brilliance of keeping it concise. The fewer words you use, the less room they have to twist it. They can call you names, they can deny the specifics, but they cannot undo the fact that you've said it and that you meant it. There's a particular discomfort that comes from being forced to look in a mirror you didn't ask for. Most of us, when we're confronted with an honest reflection, will at least consider it. We might not like what we see, but we recognize the value in adjusting our behavior. Narcissists, however, operate on a completely different plane. Their self-image is not an evolving, flexible thing. It's a rigid mask, carefully crafted to hide the insecurities and flaws they cannot bear to face. So when you speak that sentence, the one that turns the spotlight back on them, you're doing something far more dangerous than simply pointing out bad behavior. You're dragging their private reality into the light. You're saying, without flinching, this is how I see you. This is what your actions reveal. And that is something they will do almost anything to avoid. The reason this works is because narcissists are performers, Every conversation, every interaction is a stage on which they play the role they want others to believe. They're charming, intelligent, confident, whatever the role demands. But like any performance, it requires the audience to be invested. The moment the audience breaks character, the play begins to fall apart. And that's exactly what you do when you hold up a mirror in the form of a calm, direct statement. You remove yourself from the audience and hand them their own script, stripped of the embellishments. It's not just disruptive, it's humiliating because it exposes how much of their identity depends on other people's compliance. Psychologically, this is one of the most disarming moves you can make. The narcissist thrives when you're defensive because then they can direct the conversation toward your flaws or your supposed misunderstandings. But when you take that energy and turn it around, when you make them the subject of scrutiny instead, they lose the position of control. They can't comfortably analyze themselves because self-analysis would force them to confront the gap between the person they pretend to be and the person they actually are. And that gap is precisely what they've built their entire persona to conceal. It's important to understand that you don't need to do this in an aggressive way. In fact, the more neutral you are, the more effective it becomes. Think of it like holding up a mirror silently. You're not arguing, you're not justifying, you're not trying to convince them to change. You're simply showing them what's there. And because their ego is so fragile, even this minimal exposure feels like an attack. They may call you cruel, accuse you of twisting things, or try to shift the conversation entirely. That's because they can't stand in that spotlight for long without feeling the walls of their identity start to shake. From a broader perspective, what you're doing in that moment is reclaiming your role in the interaction. You're no longer the one being examined, criticized, or shaped to fit their narrative. Instead, you're the one doing the observing. And observation, when it's grounded in reality, is incredibly powerful. It removes the emotional fog they rely on to keep you uncertain and puts you in the position of seeing clearly. And once you see clearly, you can no longer be so easily controlled. So when you turn the spotlight back on a narcissist, understand this, you're not just revealing them to themselves. You're revealing them to you. And once you've seen the truth of who they are without the charm, without the manipulation, without the mask, you'll never again be tempted to mistake the performance for the person. That clarity is the beginning of your freedom. There's something profoundly liberating about realizing that you are allowed to speak the truth and draw a line without fear of the consequences. For a long time, especially in relationships with narcissists, people operate under the illusion that their safety depends on keeping the other person happy. You measure your tone, your words, your facial expressions as if you're walking across thin ice that might crack at any second. You internalize the idea that their mood dictates your peace. But once you learn that you can say the sentence that establishes your boundary and survive the fallout, you begin to reclaim a fundamental truth: your peace is yours to protect, and no one has the right to hold it hostage. The first time you do it, you may feel an almost physical shift inside you. There's the initial rush of fear, the voice in your head that says, they're going to explode, they're going to punish you for this. But then you notice something strange, you're still standing. The world didn't end. The consequences you feared may still come, but you realize you are strong enough to face them. And that awareness is intoxicating because for so long, you've been conditioned to believe you were too fragile to challenge the balance of power. You see, that conditioning is part of the control. The narcissist's greatest weapon isn't their words or their temper. It's the belief they've planted in you that you can't live without their approval. Once you pierce that illusion, a new kind of confidence emerges. It's not the loud, performative kind that shouts to prove its strength. It's quiet. It's steady. It's the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself because it knows its own value. And that kind of self-assurance is something a narcissist can't compete with because their entire strategy relies on you questioning yourself. The more certain you are of your worth, the harder it becomes for them to chip away at it. This liberation isn't just about one relationship either. It seeps into the rest of your life. Once you've stood your ground with someone who has spent years trying to control your reality, you start to recognize where else you've been giving away your power. You become more selective with who you allow close to you. You stop entertaining people who treat respect like it's negotiable. And perhaps most importantly, you stop negotiating your boundaries in exchange for temporary harmony. Psychologically, this shift is critical because it reorients your internal compass. Before, you were navigating based on their reactions, constantly adjusting yourself to avoid their disapproval. Now you're navigating based on your own values and principles. That's the difference between living reactively and living intentionally. And intentional living is the death of manipulation. because it removes the unpredictability that manipulators exploit. Of course, this doesn't mean the narcissist will suddenly respect you. In fact, they may intensify their tactics in an attempt to regain control. But here's the key: their attempts will no longer work the same way. You've built an inner resistance that doesn't depend on their cooperation. And once that inner resistance is in place, you stop feeling like you need to win with them or convince them or prove anything. You simply live your truth and let the rest fall where it may. That's why liberation isn't just the absence of control, it's the presence of self-respect. And when you have that, you don't need their validation, their approval, or their version of reality. You have your own. And once you've tasted that freedom, you will never again allow yourself to be chained by someone else's opinion of who you're allowed to be. Now, the cost of delivering this truth is that you must accept the fallout. They might lash out, they might retreat, they might try to discredit you. But the deeper reality is that in that moment, you've done something extraordinary. You've shifted the conversation from their narrative to actual reality. And once the truth is out, it doesn't matter how much they try to bury it. It exists, and it can't be erased from your awareness. So when you speak the truth a narcissist can't bear to hear, remember this: you're not just confronting them. You're freeing yourself. You're stepping out of their story and back into your own. And there is nothing more threatening to a liar than someone who refuses to live inside their lie. Silence is one of the most underestimated forces in human interaction, and yet it's often the most decisive. We tend to think of power as something expressed through action, through words, movement, volume. But with narcissists, the most potent follow-up to your boundary sentence isn't more explanation, more defense, or even more confrontation. It's the deliberate absence of all of that. It's refusing to re-enter the script they've prepared for you. Because here's the thing: the sentence itself is disruptive, yes, but what truly terrifies them is what comes after. When you refuse to fill the air with justification or backtracking, when you allow your words to stand on their own and you retreat into unshakable silence. That silence does two things simultaneously. First, it signals to the narcissist that you are not afraid of the space that follows your boundary. Many people, after making a strong statement, feel compelled to soften it, to explain, to reassure, to make the other person understand. That's the very instinct a narcissist relies on, because it gives them an opening to draw you back into the emotional exchange where they have the advantage. Silence closes that opening. It communicates that you're comfortable letting the truth sit there untouched without needing their approval or response. Second, silence forces them to confront themselves. Narcissists are masters of distraction. They keep themselves occupied with your reactions, your defenses, your attempts to appease. But when you remove all of that, they are left alone with the reality you've just presented. And solitude, for someone who avoids self-reflection at all costs, is unbearable. It's in that quiet where the mask begins to itch, where the cracks become harder to ignore. They may try to provoke you into breaking the silence, throwing accusations, playing the victim, or suddenly switching to charm. But if you hold steady, you deny them the emotional fuel they're desperate to reclaim. From a psychological perspective, this is the final break in their pattern. You've spoken the truth, you've refused to be controlled, you've turned the mirror toward them. And now, by refusing to re-engage, you're dismantling the cycle altogether. Every manipulative relationship thrives on repetition. They act, you react, they adjust, you adjust. Silence interrupts that rhythm entirely. And when you don't dance to their beat, they realize they no longer have music to play. The challenge, of course, is that silence can feel excruciating for you too. You may feel guilt. You may feel the urge to fix the tension. You may fear that your quiet will be seen as weakness or submission. But in truth, it's the opposite. Silence in this context is a loud declaration of self-control. It's saying, I am not here to perform for you anymore. I am not here to keep your emotional weather calm at the expense of my own. And it requires a deep trust in yourself that your worth doesn't depend on having the last word or on managing how they feel about you. What you'll notice over time is that this silence becomes a kind of shield. It keeps you from being dragged into unnecessary battles. It conserves your energy for the places in your life where it's truly needed. And it sends a clear, unmistakable message: you are no longer available for manipulation. So understand this: your silence is not emptiness. It is not a void. It is a statement every bit as powerful as the words that preceded it. And when you combine a firm boundary with that unwavering quiet, you create a reality where the narcissist can no longer reach you. That's the moment they realize the game is over, not because you won, but because you stopped playing.